The U.S. saw 3 mass shootings carried out over the holiday weekend. 2 separate shootings took place in South Carolina, while a third shooting turned deadly at a party in Pittsburgh. CBS News' Nikki Battiste has the details.
He got a gun.
This terrifying video captures the chaotic moments when shooters opened fire on partygoers in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, leaving 2 teenagers dead and almost a dozen others injured. Police say at least 90 rounds were fired into the crowd of roughly 200 people, mostly minors, at a party held at an Airbnb rental property. Video shows broken windows where people jumped in an attempt to escape the gunfire. A massive manhunt is still underway to find the shooters.
We owe it to everybody in the city of Pittsburgh to get those that are responsible for this.
The violence was just one of multiple deadly mass shootings this holiday weekend. In Columbia, South Carolina, 22-year-old Joanne M. Price was arrested in connection with Saturday's shooting at a mall that sent shoppers fleeing for safety. 14 people were injured. Price is charged with unlawful carrying of a pistol. A separate South Carolina town was the site of another mass shooting when gunshots rang out at a club early Sunday morning. 9 were injured. The violent weekend is part of a broader trend in violence. This year, there have already been 142 mass shootings.
There's been a huge increase in the number of guns purchased by Americans, and there's been some reductions in the requirements that people have about how they access and carry and own those guns.
John Roman, a senior fellow at NORC at the University of Chicago, says access to guns is one of a combination of factors behind the violence.
How much of a role has the pandemic played in these increases?
Yeah, the pandemic played a huge role in the increase in gun violence in the United States, especially among young men who were separated from all their pro-social supports, from school, from work, from community, from church. They lived in places, where the gun violence is very concentrated, and that led to a cycle of shootings and retaliations, and we're still seeing the repercussions of that cycle.
Nikki Battiste, CBS News.
For more on this is Lisa Dadio. She is a former police lieutenant and director of the Center for Advanced Policing at the University of New Haven. Lisa, thank you so much for being with us. And I'd love to get your take on these 3 mass shootings over the weekend, whether they illustrate that we are, in fact, seeing an increase in violent crimes of this type, and what's behind it.
So as we've been seeing for quite some time now, especially within the past 2+ years, we have seen a spike in violent crime throughout the country. Obviously, this weekend with the 3 mass shootings is no exception to what we've been seeing throughout the country for the past 2+ years. If you look at the cycle of how violence has gone on throughout the country over decades, we've had these ebbs and flows every so many years, and researchers and the law enforcement community are always trying to figure out the why, what's driving it, what's causing it. In the past, different events that were occurring in the country and throughout the world were definitely driving that. And early on, myself included, we were saying that the pandemic had a lot to do with that because of lockdowns and kind of everything that everybody was feeling, the stress of it all. But here we are out of lockdowns for the most part, and yet we're still seeing a huge spike in violent crime throughout the country.
Yeah, and you heard in Nikki's piece, the expert there saying that the men who were involved in these crimes were separated in some ways from their communities, from their churches, from their schools. But that's something that we saw on an across-the-board basis during the pandemic. Young people, young men and young women, a lot more time on their hands, a lot less to do, and a lot less engaged just because they physically weren't able to be engaged. Do you feel that those impacts are going to be long-lasting, and how do you reverse them?
So, it's tough. I'm not sure I agree with all of that 100%. And the reason is because most people aren't going out and committing a crime of violence. We know that a certain percentage of violent crime that's occurring throughout the country are committed by the same individuals. So whether or not we had, 2 years of on and off lockdowns and the restrictions that were in place, we definitely believe that had something to do with what we're seeing. I'm not sure that now and what happened this weekend and what we've been seeing over the past few months is the reason for that. I think, if we look at the why and we're looking at who the shooters are, the people who committed the crime, it's looking at who they are. What story do they tell? What type of events in their lives have impacted them to get to a point where they go and shoot at a party or go and shoot at a mall or go and shoot at a subway? Like, what triggered all of that?
So there are all kinds of solutions that get proposed, from getting guns off the streets on one hand to relaxing gun restrictions on the other hand, increasing police funding, more community engagement. What do you see as some of the most proven solutions when it comes to reducing crime?
So we know throughout the country that most law enforcement agencies, there is a deficiency in positions. Officers are not there due to a lot of different reasons. Retirements, people leaving the profession because of some things that have occurred over the past few years that have had a direct impact on policing throughout the country. The pandemic definitely impacted that as well. And so every single major law enforcement agency, and even the medium-sized departments, are facing huge staffing shortages. So you have less resources on the street. That's one aspect of it. Our community resources. We know that in order to be successful in a lot of these violent reduction type of programs and initiatives, we need our community partners to help. And so they're faced by the same challenges as we are in law enforcement. Lack of personnel, lack of resources, lack of funding. And so it's coming together to come up with solutions. We've done it before when we've had these spikes in violent crime that tend to happen I don't want to say every 10 years because that's not 100% accurate, but that ebb and flow throughout the history of policing over decades. And it's working together. There's a lot of things that can be done. Some of it is being done throughout the country, and we're seeing it in our larger cities. Where they are really doing a more targeted effort in law enforcement for those violent people that tend to be committing the majority of the crimes. And so, that's one aspect of it. And we're not going to arrest our way out of this issue because it never stops crime. Stricter gun control, you mentioned that isn't always a solution either. And without naming cities, we know that hasn't worked other places in this country. So, it's how do we tackle this issue that's going on and involving as many people as we can, both at the federal, state, and local level, along with our community, is going to be huge to impacting.
Yeah, it's such a complicated issue. The White House recently has been focused on ghost guns, these guns that people can purchase in various parts online, put them together themselves. There's no serial number, so it makes it very difficult to track them. Part of the reason the White House is so focused on this is because they can't do some of the big things they would like to do without congressional action. So how much of an impact do you think requiring serial numbers on ghost guns, that type of thing, how much of an impact do you think that that's really going to make?
I don't think it's going to have a big impact at all. Maybe longer term down the road. What we're seeing now, and I'm sure our partners throughout the country will tell you, the guns that are being used in these crimes aren't ghost guns that are being utilized. If somebody wants to commit an act of violence, they're going to go ahead and do whatever means they have to. They can steal a firearm. We know there's hundreds of thousands of firearms that have been stolen throughout the country. They're stolen from firearm manufacturers. So there's this black market that people want to commit crimes can get a gun very easily. The whole part of making guns now through ghost guns, as the term is, yes, that is going to have somewhat of an impact, probably with some more larger scale types of crimes. But I think what we're seeing with the violent crime spike as a whole is not the guns from those types of, I don't want to say purchases, but that source of the ghost gun.
Mm-hmm. Well, a distressing challenge, Lisa, and as you point out, it's going to probably take a whole bunch of different efforts to try to tackle the problem. Thank you so much for joining us today, Lisa Dadio.
Thank you so much for having me.